How's it going, class? Welcome on back. Today we're going to be going over chapter 4. So we'll just jump right into it here. So today's chapter, as you should already know if you've done the reading, is going to be fatigue. What is it good for? Okay. So potential causes of fatigue. So we have different causes of fatigue. Okay, essentially, and you can think about fatigue as both a protective mechanism and both an adaptive mechanism. Okay, so which I'll explain in a second here. We take a peek at these things here, right? Neuromuscular junction failure, right? We talked about that with the acetylcholine being released from the alpha motor neuron into the motor end plate so that the muscle cell can pick up on it and be stimulated. You could have contraction failures, right? So the calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum that binds the troponin, which moves the tropomyosin so that the myosin active binding sites can go through the cross bridge cycle, go through the power stroke, as well as substrate depletion. We'll talk about metabolite accumulation and oxidative stress. Okay, so we'll go over all those things. So, like I said, you can think of fatigue as both a protective mechanism and as a adaptive mechanism. So, in the way it's a protective mechanism, you can think about it as when you do some sort of exercise, right? We usually say like strength training just because it's the easiest to visualize. You get muscle damage, okay? And you want to make sure that you are not damaging that muscle too much. So in a way, the fatigue that keeps you from just working at that same pace, right? You're doing squats or curls or sprinting or whatever it is, right? The fatigue that you feel during that exercise actually functions as a protective mechanism to keep you from working too hard. And that's part of its process, right? It's not like what fatigue was originally manifested for, right? But a big portion of what fatigue is a way of your body telling, or a way of certain parts of your body telling your brain or telling other localized parts of your body, hey, we need to slow down. This is starting to become very, very strenuous. And this stress is becoming too much for the body to handle. So we need to begin to slow down, right? As well as you can think of fatigue as an adaptive paradigm, right? So every training bout creates both fitness and fatigue, which summates to create preparedness, right? So, like I said before in my other lectures, is that the body is a working factory of lazy teenagers. Okay, when you elicit a stressor, you work out, and the workout is the stressor, right? Your body wants to prepare itself so that the next time that it goes through that stressor, the next time it is introduced to that stressor, it is not as much of a stress. So what the body does is the body adapts. It changes things within the muscle, it changes things within the delivery system of oxygen, changes things within the central nervous system, so that when that same exact stressor is elicited on the body once more, it is not as stressful to the body as it was originally. Okay. So high training loads result in both elevated fatigue and fitness level, and low training loads result in minimal fitness or fatigue. And that should make sense, right? The harder you train, right, you're going to elicit more fatigue, but also you should elicit more adaptation, right? So we have our alarm phase. We talk about this here, our alarm phase, the initial phase of training, when the stimulus is first recognized, the performance generally decreases, right? This is like when you're running, right? If you try to sprint for a long time, you're going to eventually slow down. If you try to lift the same exact weight for a while, you're eventually not going to be lifted anymore, right? Next, you have the resistance phase. The second phase is what the adaptation occurs, right? So this is after you were done exercising. This is the adaptation to the exercise, okay? So you elicited some sort of stimulus. Let's say you curled 25 pounds or whatever it was, okay? That was a stressor for the body. Now, in the resistance phase, your body is adapting to that. It's laying down more tissue for the muscle. It's laying down more contractile units, more sarcomeres. It's strengthening the fibrinous connections. You are adding synergistic contraction to allow for more force production, right? There's a lot of different things that are occurring that we may or may not get into, but essentially your body is adapting in a way so that when you provide a stimulus that's the same as it was before, or maybe even harder, your body is more adapted to it. And that's why when you go to the gym for the first time after like a month or so, like I just did here after Christmas break, I went home and enjoyed eating some good food and not worrying about anything else at all, and just sitting around in the cold in North Dakota. Right, we landed and it was 18 below, wind chill of -56. So it was a pretty chilly one up in North Dakota for the week I was home, and we stayed inside a lot. And then during that week, right, I was not training at all. And when I came back to the gym, okay, and I got my first workouts in, I felt really sore the next few days. And part of that is detraining, right? And part of that is, right, is what we're talking about here. I needed to go through that initial stimulus again to get this resistance phase, to get the adaptations back so that I would be adapted to that stimulus. That's why, like I said, if you don't work out for a long time and you come back and try to do the same weights you were doing before, right, you've obviously gone through detraining, and now that stimulus is once again very stressful for the body, right? So fatigue dissipates faster than fitness, right? So if you go out and exercise, right, you're more than likely going to recover within a few days, right? It takes you usually up to a week or 2 weeks to begin to detrain for your fitness to begin to drop, right? So if you go out and you run a mile, you're probably gonna be tired for however long. If you're me, you're probably gonna be tired for the rest of the day. But that fatigue lasts is a lot more acute, right? And the fitness paradigm, the fitness that you gain from that exercise will last a little bit longer, but you will eventually lose it over time if you do not continue to train. And then finally, we have overtraining, right? So you should be familiar with what overtraining is. So if the stresses are too high, performance can be further suppressed. So if you are training too hard, if you're training too often, if you're training too long, right? Essentially, your body is not able to fully recover in between those workout bouts. And we talked about that before, where you have to balance. I talked about the Alabama strength training program, where you have to balance the stimulus of training with recovery. Because if you were not allowing enough time for recovery, or you were training too hard, you were going to begin to provide a detriment to performance for your athletes, and that's exactly the opposite of thing that you want to do, right? And then there's two different types of fatigue, or excuse me, of fatigue that we're going to talk about, right? So specifically peripheral and central fatigue, right? So peripheral is fatigue that happens exactly where it sounds, in the periphery. So that's happening in the localized areas where the ATP, where the exercise is being done, right? If you are doing hamstring curls, right, you're going to have peripheral fatigue that occurs in the hamstrings. It's not going to be occurring in your pectoralis major. It's not going to be occurring in your abs, right? The peripheral fatigue is occurring in a localized area of the muscle of action, or the muscles of action, right? Let's say you're doing a squat, there's a lot of muscles involved, okay? That is where the peripheral fatigue is going to be occurring, which can essentially start to affect central fatigue a little bit later on, but we're not going to get too far into that. And then what central fatigue is, essential fatigue is stimulated or brought about from the brain systemically, right? From the central nervous system systemically. So peripheral fatigue relies on energy depletion, metabolite depletion, changes in pH, neural changes, right? Specific neural changes right at the localized muscle. And then central fatigue is more has to do with motivation and focus, right? Perceived fatigue, body temperature, hypoglycemia, so low blood sugar, right? These are things that are happening more systemically that are slowing down your ability to go through muscle contraction or your ability to do any sort of exercise. So with this, there's something called accumulation hypothesis. We'll talk about two of these hypotheses, right? The first one here, accumulation hypothesis, is saying that accumulated metabolic byproducts such as hydrogen ions, which is our acidosis, right? Inorganic phosphates, potassium, ADP, these things accumulating are what stimulate or what mitigate your ability to produce force and continue your exercise, right? So pH decreases. So don't get confused. If pH is decreasing, that is because more hydrogen ions are being added, right? It's becoming more acidic. The more acidic something becomes, the lower its pH is, right? So as pH decreases, as hydrogen ions increase, right, it interferes with calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And if you remember, you need that calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum in order to bind to the troponin, move the tropomyosin, and allow for cross-bridge cycling to occur, which is where you get your force from, right? So if no actin and myosin are binding, right, or that binding is diminished, you're not going to be able to generate as much force, right? pH also directly, or excuse me, also directly affects actin myosin affinity. So the affinity those two proteins have together, right, for them to latch onto each other, right, a lower pH decreases that affinity. So that bond between the myosin and the actin will not be as strong. And therefore, when you go through that power stroke, right, when that power stroke occurs to try to pull the myosin tries to pull the actin, right? That bond is not as strong, and therefore the myosin cannot pull on the actin with as much force, right? pH decrease also interferes with ATP breakdown. So lower pH, right, reduces ATPase's effectiveness. So ATPase is the enzyme that cleaves, it cuts ATP. If you have low pH, you're going to be messing with that effectiveness of the enzyme to actually do its job. So now, not only are you less able to go through muscle contraction in terms of the proteins and the calcium release, but also the ATP, which is required to make that power stroke happen, make that contraction occur, is less effective as well, right? And then it also interferes with ATP production, right, by decreasing activity of enzymes. So again, it's messing with enzymes. So we talk about, you think when you get sick, right? You get sick, your normal body temperature is 98.6 or somewhere in a small window right there, right? When you get sick, you get a fever, okay? And your fever is meant to kill off the bacteria, but you've also manifested or you've also felt the manifestation of the symptoms of the fever where you feel very lethargic, you feel very tired, you can't do anything, right? That is because the body functions at a very, very specific temperature, right? Everything in the body, right, depending on certain organs and certain areas, right, function at an optimal temperature. Same thing with pH, okay? Your body is in a slightly acidic environment. If you make the environment more acidic, it becomes less effective at its job. Just like if you were to decrease the temperature or increase the temperature, you decrease or increase the pH or the acidity of the body, that is going to negatively affect the effectiveness of many of the enzymes and processes within your body, okay? And our other hypothesis is depletion hypothesis, right? So this is a two-part hypothesis, right? So first of all, we have neural depletion, okay? So this is talking specifically about the nerve itself and what's going on. So depletion of ACH, which is acetylcholine, right? The main neurotransmitter of the alpha motor neuron, okay? If you stimulate the muscle over and over, you may deplete storage vesicles of ACH, right? So if we remember, the neuron, the alpha motor neuron, releases vesicles of ACH that move across the synapse and bind to the muscle cell, which allow for it to be depolarized. Eventually, if you keep doing that over and over and over and over, the alpha motor neuron begins to not have enough of those vesicles to release, right? It runs out of the stores of acetylcholine, and it can no longer be effectively releasing as much acetylcholine into the synapse, and therefore the muscles themselves cannot be stimulated as effectively, right? And also, action potentials no longer are propagated, right? So the action potential that actually transfers down the neuron itself, right, may also be affected and may also no longer propagate, right? It's very, very difficult to demonstrate this, right? This can be seen in ultra endurance events like the marathon or ultra marathons, right? It's very, very hard to measure this because you need to put somebody through a very extreme bouts, right? Because it is happening in such small amounts, okay? You think about one tiny little nerve and innervating a few muscle fibers, right? Imagine how small that amount of acetylcholine actually is, right? In order to get to a point where we can measure it, where the amount of detriment is large enough for us to measure it, right? We need to get people through super intense activities. But because we do that, we can essentially extrapolate down to less strenuous exercise and say, hey, this is also probably occurring there. We just don't have the technology to measure it yet, right? As well as substrate depletion. So substrate is just anything that is needed essentially to provide some sort of energy, right? So we talked about the phosphagen system, right? The PCR, ATP PCR system, our quick energy system, right? So if you are depleting phosphagen, right, phosphocreatine is resynthesized into ATP, right? So if you are depleting the phosphocreatine, right, if you're depleting the phosphocreatine, which then rephosphorylates the ADP into ATP, right, that process is not occurring as much, right? If you're trying to build something, right, you're trying to build something that requires two parts, right? Say my left hand here is ADP and my right hand is the inorganic phosphate that's coming from phosphocreatine. If you don't have that one part anymore, you can't make your whole. You can't make the ATP like you want to, right? And then finally, glycogen depletion, right? So glycogen depletion or glucose depletion is molecules of glucose, right? So after a certain amount of time, right, the molecules that you were actually breaking down to produce ATP also become depleted, right? That's why I talked about marathon runners, they'll eat those carbohydrate gels, right? Because you need to replenish the body's stores of glycogen and glucose, right? And if you're unfamiliar with what glycogen is just a polymer version of glucose. It's just a bunch of glucose lined up, and it's how you store glucose in the muscles or in the liver, right? So after a certain period of time, is you become more and more active, and you're active for longer and longer and longer. Essentially, you begin to deplete your stores, your intramuscular and intra liver stores of glycogen, And therefore, if you have no fuel for the fire, if you have no glucose to produce ATP, or it's massively diminished, you're going to be massively diminishing your ability to produce ATP from that fuel source, right? So when depleted, the athlete must slow down and use fatty acids, right? So, and if we remember, if you're utilizing fatty acids as a fuel source, that takes much longer to produce ATP. So if the amount of ATP that you can produce at any one point is much lower because you are utilizing fatty acids, the pace at which you are running must be much slower, right? The pace at which you can make ATP, right, it drives how quickly you can function. Like the phosphagen system has that quick explosive amount of energy that it released, so you can move explosively, right? But free fatty acids being metabolized takes a long time. It's very efficient, but it takes a long time. And therefore, because only a slow trickle of ATP is being produced, you have to slow down your race pace. You're not able to perform at as high of a level, right? So a simplified way to think about fatigue, right? So this is what we're saying. So moderate below lactate threshold, right? After a long duration, if you're below lactate threshold, usually you'll see a lot of central fatigue, dehydration, right? Glycogen depletion, hypoglycemia, hypoglycemia being low blood sugar, and heavy or severe exercise intensity, severe exercise intensity, you're going to see impaired ATP production due to metabolic acidosis, right? So usually your shorter duration bout exercises have a lot more to do with peripheral fatigue. Not always, but you can think of it kind of in that way. Shorter term, high intensity usually has to do more with peripheral fatigue, and longer duration is a little bit more central fatigue. They both manifest in both areas, but just the primary stimulus in each one is linked to central peripheral, right? So common causes of fatigue, right? So we talked about these, just talked about these: PCR, ATP, and glycogen depletion, right? Acid accumulation, hydrogen ion accumulation, pH drop, dehydration, metabolic acidosis, which is the same thing as hydrogen accumulation, right? And disrupted neural transmission, right? Not only do the hydrogen ions affect the cross-bridge cycling at the local muscle, but as decreased body pH, increased hydrogen ions systemically around your body also mess with your neural transmission from the brain. So remember our energy systems, right? Phosphocreatine, anaerobic glycolysis or the glycolytic system, and then aerobic glycolysis or the aerobic system, okay? So think about the fatigue mechanisms that are occurring here, right? If we have acidosis, okay, that's affecting multiple enzymes, okay? If it's affecting multiple enzymes, which one of these energy systems is it probably going to affect the most? Well, probably the aerobic glycolysis of the oxidative system, because we have all the enzymes in glycolysis, then we have all the enzymes in the Krebs cycle, and then we have all the enzymes involved in the electron transport chain. And so if you are providing or producing hydrogen ions, it's going to affect enzymes. The energy system with the most enzymes is probably going to be the one that's most highly affected, right? So phosphocreatine depletion, right? So phosphocreatine, right? We said once PCR is depleted, exercise intensity must decrease. So this is why when you sprint, you can only maintain that maximal velocity for a very short period of time because you are no longer able to produce ATP at such a fast rate. You have to slow down, right? So creatine supplementation helps to prolong PCR depletion. Like I said before, when you supplement with creatine, you increase those stores of phosphocreatine, as well as you slightly increase your body's ability to resynthesize phosphocreatine. And that phosphocreatine is what is used to rephosphorylate that ATP very quickly, right? Remember, it's that one reaction outside of the mitochondria. Phosphocreatine donates its phosphate to ADP to make ATP, right? If that phosphocreatine store is depleted, right, you are no longer able to resynthesize ATP in that way, right? As well as glycogen depletion, right? Glycogen is your fuel for high intensity exercise, right? That very short duration, 6 to 10 seconds is mainly the PCR, but the next minute to 2 minutes is mainly glycogen, right? We are utilizing glycogen or glucose, right, to produce ATP for high intensity exercise, right? So glycogen usage is directly related to exercise intensity. Like we said, remember our RER, if you were exercising more intensely, you are using what substrate? You are using glucose or carbohydrates because they can be more quickly metabolized in the ATP than fats can, right? And if you are a lower intensity, right, you're utilizing more fats and lower glycogen, right? So the higher intensity that you work at, the higher your usage of glycogen will be, right? So you use it for fuel and muscle contraction. So if we look at our graph on the left here, right, looking at muscle glycogen, move this. All right, get this out of your way. Let's see what's going on here. Right? We look at muscle glycogen over exercise time. We see here over a long period of exercise, up to 3 hours, we have a massive glycogen depletion, right? From 160-ish millimoles per kilogram all the way down to 25%, right? So we're cutting it basically in almost an eighth here, right? We're cutting out 7/8 of our muscle glycogen stores, right? And so not only do you have less glycogen to burn for the fuel, but because that glycogen is spread out, it is sporadically spread out throughout the muscle, right? Your ability to extract that glycogen at each individual point becomes diminished, and you are not able to readily produce ATP like you need to, right? As well as perceived exertion, right? This makes sense as well. This should be pretty obvious. As you exercise or as your exercise becomes longer, right, your perceived exertion, right, is going to get higher, right? So when muscles are low, glycogen can result in peripheral and central fatigue, right? So your perceived exertion. So in this way, like I said, the main stimulus here is on just your lack of ability to produce ATP from glycogen, but also the depletion of glycogen can lead to higher perceived exertion, which is going to make you fatigue more quickly. And in that way, it is also central fatigue. Look over here, sorry. Right, glycogen usage is task specific and it's also muscle specific, right? So we look at this, right? We can look at our glycogen usage, millimoles per kilogram, right? We see in the gastrocs, glycogen usage is higher in all categories, right? And level on uphill and downhill, it's higher than soleus and the vastus lateralis, right? So glycogen usage is task dependent. It's also muscle dependent. When we look at the tasks here, we see if you were to imagine which of these activities is the most difficult, right? You would probably say uphill walking, right? And we see that for these two, right? We see uphill walking for these two, right, is the most strenuous in terms of glycogen depletion, right? If we remember the soleus is very type 1 and relies a lot on free fatty acids, as well as the soleus is used in a little bit different way in the ankle or in the calf, right? And so in this way, soleus is stressed more for downhill walking. But for the most part, right, we see that the more strenuous task, uphill walking, requires more glycogen than the other tasks. So we're talking about hypoglycemia. So I talked about before, right? Get this really out of the way. Put this down here for now. Step before with diabetes. So those who have diabetes don't release insulin from their pancreas, or they may also be insensitive to the insulin that is released from the pancreas. So usually type 1 diabetes has to do with individuals that don't release the insulin, and type 2 developed diabetes has to do with an insensitivity to insulin, right? And so hypoglycemia specifically is just low blood sugar, right? So it occurs when muscle or liver glycogen is depleted, right? Liver maintains blood glucose at rest. So what you do during exercise usually is you can supplement with carbohydrates or with glucose to prevent yourself from going into a low blood sugar state. And the reason that diabetics you'll hear often get hypoglycemic or they'll get low blood sugar is because they have very poor regulatory systems of maintaining blood glucose. So they'll go through hyperglycemia after they eat, where they have blurred vision, dry mouth, right? They feel like they have super high blood sugar. In certain cases, they'll even have sugar in the urine, making it smell sweet, right? And then during exercise, they'll go through stages of hypoglycemia because they are not able to regulate blood sugar. They're not able to release blood sugar glycogen from the liver into the blood. And so they go through stages of hypoglycemia, which you may have felt before if you're exercising. I remember the first time I experienced this, I think I was 17 years old in high school, and I went to the gym at 5 a.m. to go work out and didn't eat. And I knew that I was going to be going to Buffalo Wild Wings that night and eating a bunch of food and drinking a bunch of soda. And so I told myself that I need to work out really hard. Well, about halfway through my workout, I basically collapsed to the floor and was feeling nauseous and dizzy and can hardly move because I was having a hypoglycemic moment. I was having extremely low blood sugar, and it took somebody carrying me to the locker room, me laying on the ground for about half an hour before somebody realized what was probably occurring. got me some orange juice and some food, and I finally came back to it about a couple hours later. But if you've ever experienced hypoglycemia, it is very, very unpleasant because you are not getting blood sugar to the muscles and to the brain that is needed. You have a massive reaction in that way. So as exercise duration increases, more liver glycogen is utilized. So that makes sense. The glucose or glycogen stores within the muscles are being utilized, right? So in order to keep the stores of muscle, right, readily replenished, you need to mobilize glycogen from the liver. So you can think about this as, all the homes around, let's say a lake. I'm from North Dakota, and Minnesota is very, very heavy lake country, right? And so a lot of the lakes out there have lots of lake homes around them, and people love to have their bonfires out there, right? So obviously, right, if you are the muscle or you are the person at the cabin, you want localized fuel. You want glycogen in the muscle, or you want wood at your log cabin, right, or at your cabin, okay? So that you can burn it for fuel, ATP, or you can burn it for heat around the bonfire. Now, as you begin to diminish your localized stores, like your local woodpile or your local stores of glycogen, you're going to need to mobilize and go get more, right? You're going to need to go get more wood, right? Or in the case of the body here specifically, you're going to need to release glucose from the liver so that it can be transferred to the muscles or to the lake cabin so that it can be utilized there, right? So insulin levels decrease during exercise, but muscle insulin sensitivity increases, right? So you're reducing the amount of insulin during exercise because, or as a function of blood flow, right? But the muscles are made to be more sensitive to insulin. So that little bit of amount, or that little amount of insulin that actually is in the bloodstream, is enough to stimulate the draw in or the intake of the glucose that is in the bloodstream, right? And that's essentially meant to make it a peripherally specific thing, right? So if you just release insulin throughout the body everywhere, you're going to be having a massive uptake of insulin in all areas of the body, right? But if you decrease the amount of insulin and just the active muscles increase their sensitivity to insulin, right? That means that just the active muscles are going to be the ones that are actually drawing in the glucose. So in that way, you can specialize or make a specific area more sensitive to taking in glucose than the whole body, which is what you would obviously want. So dehydration, right? So dehydration is a massive way of inducing fatigue, right? So it increases plasma osmolarity, which just means plasma concentration of solutes. So if you think of any solution, if you decrease the amount of water but keep the solutes within it the same, it's going to become more concentrated, right? It also increases blood viscosity. Same thing. If you are decreasing the amount of water in a liquid and it decreases a lot, it's kind of like if you've ever cooked, right? You allow things to simmer so that the sauce that you are making will become more viscous. They'll become more thick, right? Because you were cooking out that water, right? So these things will affect heart rate, right? As well as core, skin, and brain temperature, right? So if your core temperature, your brain temperature are increasing, right? You're going to have protective mechanisms in order to prevent you from increasing those temperatures, as they may be detrimental to your body, right? Right, well as it decreases blood volume, we talk about that. If blood volume is decreased, right, your overall amount of blood in the body, your stroke volume is also going to decrease, right, which is going to decrease your cardiac output. And if you're decreasing your cardiac output, that means you're not pumping as much blood to the areas that are in need, right, which means that those areas are not getting the nutrients they need, and you're not removing the metabolic byproducts like you need, and you're going to see more fatigue, right? As well as throughout this, right, your sweat rate is obviously going to increase initially when you are exercising, right? So you need to cool the body. But as you go through stages of hypothermia, right, as you go through stages of dehydration, you're going to see the sweat rate decrease, as well as, right, the glycogen synthesis, right? Initially during exercise, right, you were utilizing glycogen as a fuel source. As you begin to continue to exercise and as you begin to see these stages of fatigue manifest, your glycogen synthesis is also going to decrease, right? And then finally on the bottom here, attention and focus is going to decrease, right? So the attention and focus that you have during exercise, as I'm sure you felt before, as you get towards the end of the game, the fourth quarter of your basketball game or the end of your race, right? Your attention to detail and your ability to react to changes massively, right? This is part of the reason, not the main reason why you see a lot of a lot more injuries late in exercise and late in sporting events is because your ability to adapt and work with changes is slightly diminished. So, right, so we see here that our dehydration is going to impair aerobic exercise performance, right? And this has a lot to do with our cardiac output component, right? If you're decreasing the amount of blood, if you're making it more viscous, if you're not able to pump that blood around the body in as efficient of a manner, you're not going to be able to function at as high of a capacity, right? So our dehydrated individual here is lower at all distances within our race, right? Because they probably have lower cardiac output, they're not able to deliver the nutrients to the body or the body areas that are in need, right? And therefore, you are not able to exercise at as high of a capacity, right? So here we're just talking about sweat loss, right? So you can see here, you can lose up to 2.6 pounds an hour, or 1.2 liters of sweat an hour. So if you're outside working very strenuously, right, you have 5 liters of blood in your body, right? 5 liters of blood. And in just an hour of strenuous exercise outside in the heat, you can lose 1.2 liters of sweat. Now, that's not all water from your blood, but you don't have a lot more water in your blood or water in your body than that, right? You have some intracellular water as well as you have some extracellular water, which is what's in the blood, right? But in 2 hours of exercise outside, you just lost 2.4 liters of water. That's a massive detriment in the amount of water in your body, as well as a massive detriment in the amount of water in your blood, and you're going to see massive diminishments in your ability to exercise, right? So you want to make sure that when you are doing some sort of exercise, right, you are taking into account the amount of water loss you're going to have, which I'm sure many of you are obviously familiar with. It. When you exercise, you drink water, right, because you're being stimulated to drink that water. And you want to think during these exercises, right, these are highly independent to the environment and to the individual, right? So environmental temperature, you're obviously going to need more water and more replenishment of electrolytes in a hot environment. So down here in Florida, I'm sure the high school football teams playing in 95-degree heat with it being humid, right, are less or are more prone to dehydration than somebody playing in North Dakota when the games are, 75, 60 degrees in the fall, right? Radiant heat load, right? So the more heat that is brought to the body, or more heat that is trapped on the body is going to increase your sweating rate. Humidity. So how humidity works, right, is humidity is actually going to maybe slightly is going to affect, humidity is going to work in a way it's going to affect your dehydration by making you sweat slightly more, right? So you don't actually sweat less when you're in a humid environment, which is a misnomer, right? What actually occurs is when you sweat, the act of that sweat evaporating from your body is what pulls heat away from your body, right? So the sweat that you're releasing from your body isn't cooling you down. You're not like releasing colder water as sweat, and that's what's cooling down your skin. When the sweat itself evaporates, it's drawing energy away from your body. So for it to go from a water state, a liquid state, to a gas state, it needs to pull energy from your body. And when it's really, really humid out, that process is more difficult. It's much harder to get the sweat on your skin to evaporate into an already really, really humid environment. And therefore, since you're not having as much sweat evaporate from your skin, it's mostly dripping off, you're not pulling as much body heat from your body as you would if you were in, let's say, a dry environment. So in that way, humidity is increasing sweat rate. So it's decreasing your ability to mitigate heat. And because it's increasing sweat rate, it is also increasing dehydration as well as air velocity, right? Everybody's felt where they're really, really sweaty and really hot and they jump in front of a fan and they feel much, much better, right? That's because that process of evaporation of the sweat off of your skin is increased. You're moving more and more air past your body, past the sweat beads, past the water and sweat on your skin, which is allowing for more of it to evaporate more quickly, which pulls more of the energy, more of the heat away from your body. That's why stepping in front of a fan or exercising on a windy day feels a little bit more refreshing than exercising on like a calm, humid day, as well as body size, right? So those people who have more body surface area are able to sweat more and they get more heat dissipation than those who have higher volumes and less body surface area, as well as we can look at metabolic rates. So those who have higher metabolic rates, those who go through metabolysis much quicker, produce more heat, right, are going to need sweat more to mitigate that heat. So these all in a way are affecting your sweating pace. right? So where Na moves, where sodium moves, water follows, right? So we might have seen that meme back in the day, um, of salt moving someplace and water saying, I'm in, right? It's an old chemistry meme, but maybe you haven't seen it, right? But with that, there's truth to it, right? If you retain sodium, right, you're increasing osmolarity, you're increasing the concentration of sodium within your body, which is going to increase water retention. And that's why you see, right, we see here that more sodium on the inside is going to draw water in with it. Our body actively pumps sodium across from our inner intestines, right, across into the body, which pulls water with it. It just pulls water down its concentration gradient, right? And so um, that's why many sports drinks, we'll talk about it here in a second, have these electrolytes in them. So in our sweat loss, right, following 2 hours of exercise in the heat, right, we see big drops in our electrolytes here. So we see sodium is lost through sweat, chlorine is lost through sweat, potassium is lost through sweat, magnesium is lost through sweat, and as well as it's utilized, right? These things are important for muscle function, okay? And so that's why a lot of sports drinks, okay, contain these. You see sports drinks that have high sodium, they have high potassium, they have high magnesium, right? It is to replenish the electrolytes that you are losing from sweating, and it's something that I love hearing, or I don't love hearing. It's one of those things that like just makes me want to absolutely bash my head into the wall, right? Or jump off a bridge when I go home and I listen to all the athletic trainers and all the individuals around that. And I remember hearing this all growing up when we were playing baseball out in the heat or something out in the heat. They would say, "Oh, you don't want to be drinking energy drinks because they dehydrate you. They have so much sodium in them. They have too much sugar in them, right? They're dehydrating you." Sports drinks are actually very, very good at what they do, right? Gatorade, Powerade, what are some other body armors, right? They have sugar in them, which we've talked about you need for exercise, right? You need to be replenishing those stores of sugar and glycogen for exercise, as well as they have these ions that you are losing. And newsflash, if you have a little bit higher salt intake, you are also drawing in more water so your body can retain more water. Now, you don't want to increase the salt intake so much that you can't retain or that you are increasing the osmolarity in your body so much that you provide detriment to it, right? But I can promise you that drinking Gatorade is not providing nearly enough sodium, not even remotely enough sodium to effectively dehydrate you, right? You look at like salt water, the concentration of salt in salt water is astronomically higher than it is in Gatorade. And that's why drinking salt water will further dehydrate you because the concentration of salt in salt water is higher than the concentration of salt in your body, right? But for these Gatorades, you would need to drink I don't even think you could drink enough Gatorade to effectively dehydrate yourself, right? Because the balance is correct so that you are not actually effectively dehydrating yourself, right? So sweat rates are highly individual, like I talked about, right? On average, 1 to 1.5 liters per hour, right? So sodium loss is also highly individual. Some people can lose sodium at a higher rate, right? You know people that sweat differently. Some people sweat more, some people sweat less. Some people, when they sweat, they stink more, they stink less, right? That smell has more to do with urea being released, right? But that shows that the sweat rate and the sweat concentration of individuals is highly variable. So we look at sports drinks, right? Sports drinks are isotonic, which means they do not um, dehydrate the body, right? So Gatorade, right, has 6% carbohydrates, right, and 327 milliosmoles per kilogram, right? These are meant to replenish the electrolytes in your body, right? So they're placed with Gatorade, you need to drink 3.7 bottles per hour to replenish the sodium that you are losing, right? So in a way, Gatorade might not even be concentrated enough with sodium. Okay, so drinking sports drinks is not dehydrating you while you are exercising, as well as they're not providing detriment, right? There's something that happened. I remember my senior year of high school, and this can be another example from high school. Our football team, right, was going to be playing in 105-degree heat, which is hot for anywhere, right? But it's effectively a lot hotter for North Dakota, probably about 15 degrees hotter than we would usually play in the summer. Okay. And so the entire football team, right, was given gallon jugs of water. And our goal, or what we were told, was that we needed to drink 2 gallons of water before our game. Okay. 2 gallons of water. That, first of all, is astronomically higher than you would ever need, right? Second of all, guess what happened during our game? we had massive amounts of cramping occurring, right? Everybody in the team was cramping, and they're just getting yelled at by the coach saying they didn't drink enough water. There wasn't enough water drank. What we actually did is because we drank so much water, right, and we urinated so much, we actually pulled out all these essential electrolytes. So we did the opposite of what we were trying to do, right? We should have been mixing in sports drinks with our fluid intake, because drinking only water actually diminished our performance and gave us cramps because we were just drawing out all the electrolytes in our body because we were urinating so often. So there's a balance to be had here, right? You obviously should be still drinking some water when you are exercising, but you should be mixing with sport drinks in order to provide a maximal benefit to your exercise, right? As well as sports drinks are great sources of carbohydrates, right? So they give us these electrolytes, right? They give us some of the replenishment of these electrolytes, right? But it's probably not enough, right? So that's why we see these crampings or these cramps are still occurring, right? These sports drinks are pretty highly specialized for exercise and to replenish those electrolytes, right? But that's not what they are originally intended for. They're basically originally intended for carbohydrate replenishment, right? They want, right, the sports drink companies, excuse me, I have a stroke there. The sports drink companies want us to be replenishing carbohydrates during these exercises, as well as a bonus effect. If you add more sugar to your sports drink, it generally tastes better. Okay. So zero sugar sports drinks, right? So zero sugar sports drinks aren't as effective as sugar sports drinks, right? Because the primary process of drinking a sports drink is to replenish sugar stores, right? But zero sugar sports drinks do have those electrolytes in them, and they are helping to replenish those electrolytes. So in summary here, sports drinks are good, right? Their main function is to replenish carbohydrates. Their secondary function is to replenish the electrolytes in your body, right? And even though replenishing electrolytes, like I said, is not their main function, they're still obviously much better at replenishing those electrolytes than just plain water. Right, so we see here, right, we got some lower calorie, we got our lower calorie sports drinks here, right? They are not as good at replenishing those carbohydrates as we need, right? But they are still pretty good at helping us throughout exercise, right? Right, hydration plans should be individualized, right? So way before and after exercise. So if you really want to find out the best way to hydrate yourself during exercise, right, you want to put yourself through a stressor or an exercise that is the same as where you're going to perform, and then you would measure your weight loss. You would measure how much water you were actually losing. The biggest thing here is you need to plan ahead, right? Do not begin exercise dehydrated. So you need to make sure, need to make sure that you are rehydrating long before you ever become dehydrated. Because once you've already become dehydrated, those fatigue effects manifest in a way that are going to diminish your performance. You want to go into your exercise already readily hydrated in order to make sure you have maximal ability to perform in those exercises. Right, so we have another thing here. We have what's called a mouth rinse, right? Carbohydrate rinse. Essentially, this has no significant changes on blood glucose. And what a mouth rinse is you are literally just, let's say, pouring Gatorade into your mouth, switching it around, and then spitting it out, right? So you're not actually increasing blood glucose, right? But the receptors in the mouth sense glucose, and the brain thinks glucose was ingested and does not decrease exercise, right? So what it does, it's a way of tricking your body into thinking that you just had glucose intake, right? Which is going to essentially somewhat diminish your central fatigue, which is going to allow you to continue to exercise at a higher pace. Now, this is obviously not good for, let's say, marathon runners, because they want to make sure that they're actually replenishing glucose. But this is good for somebody like a football player, right? They do a mouth rinse where they rinse their mouth with Gatorade and spit it out, right? They are tricking their body into thinking that they have received glucose, which allows them to perform at a higher level. Now, they could also just drink the Gatorade, right? That would be just as effective. But if you were trying to cut down on your caloric consumption here, or you're trying to cut down on the amount of liquids that you are consuming, this would be beneficial for you. Right, so we're talking about hyperthermia. So hyperthermia is our fancy way of saying increased core body temperature, right? So like I said before, there is an optimal temperature at which you function as a human being, specifically during exercise. And if you increase that temperature, right, you are going to provide a detriment, right, a detriment to that exercise. So this is going to decrease your performance, right? And it can become a medical emergency, right? If you've ever experienced hypothermia or hyperthermia and gone through heat exhaustion or heat stroke, right, you see individuals begin to basically get to a point where they are almost non-respondent, right? They are very lethargic. Individuals get nauseous, they puke, right? All sorts of detrimental things to them. And obviously, if you're in a race, let's say a cycling race, you don't want to be doing that, right? So exercise in the heat is limited by, right, faster breakdown of muscle glycogen. So you are breaking down glycogen almost too fast, right? As well as blood is redirected to the skin instead of the muscle. So in order to mitigate this heat gain, in order to get yourself to waft off this heat, to get rid of this heat that you are producing, you are shunting blood flow from the muscles and instead sending it to the skin, which is obviously going to diminish the amount of nutrient supply to the muscles. And it's going to decrease their performance, right? So greater sweating is going to cause dehydration, like we talked about, right? As well as it's going to reduce motivation, right? So the best way to get used to this is go through acclimation or acclimatization, right? You need to get to a training cycle. You need to go through a training cycle that acclimates you to these training conditions. And that's why you see a lot of times, let's say college bowl games, right? They're going to play in Florida or in the NFL. If they're going to play in Miami, right? They will travel down here earlier in that week so that they can slightly acclimate to that temperature more efficiently than if they just did it in a day. Okay, it's just like that when you hear about, if you watch NFL, I'll use this example, right? You talk about playing in Denver, right? You see a lot of players that struggle in Denver because they are not acclimated to that elevation. The same thing for hot temperatures, right? If you are not acclimated to the hot temperature, your performance is going to be severely diminished, and you're not going to be able to perform at the same level that you were if you were used to performing in colder temperatures, right? All of these things effectively lead back to central fatigue as well, right? So that increased dehydration, right? Your increased body heat, right? Your overuse of glycogen, your increase in osmolarity, the drop in pH, right? All these things are going to cause central fatigue and are effectively slowing you down, right? So we're talking about cramps here. I talked about cramps just a few minutes ago, right? But what we do know about cramps, right? Individuals who have a history of cramping are more likely to cramp in the future. So as well as stretching does not prevent cramps, but can help alleviate them, right? So a lot of people talk about cramping and they'll say, oh, you need to drink pickle juice, okay? Or you need to drink some sort of high potassium, you need to eat more bananas. That's partially true, right? It's partially true because those electrolytes are needed for proper muscle function. But generally, right, I've seen it all the time. I saw a million times watching football in high school and college, right? Somebody comes out the field in cramps and someone's like, I'll give them some pickle juice. And they drink a cup of pickle juice and they're like, oh, now you'll be good, right? It's not how it works, okay? Acute ingestion of electrolytes very, very rarely actually affects your cramping, right? Cramp electrical activity can last for over an hour, right? You need to treat and manage it for over an hour. So once someone cramps, they will probably continue to cramp, right? So ingesting electrolytes, right, is probably not going to help, right? Once cramp, one cramp will decrease performance, right? So if you have a cramp, let's say in your quadriceps or in your hamstrings, your gastrocs, whatever, it's going to decrease the performance of that muscle for the foreseeable future, for the next hour, right? No need to replace electrolytes with diet or need to replace electrolytes with diet or supplements. So when you are cramping, you need to make sure that you are not deficient in these electrolytes, right? Drinking pickle juice acutely will not affect you, right? But if you are consuming electrolytes properly in your diet, this is what we think will help with cramping in the future, right? So again, just like hydration, don't act before it's too late, right? You need to make sure that before you go into your performance, you are adequately supplementing with these electrolytes and you are adequately hydrating yourself, right? Because once you get to this state of cramping, no matter what you do, you're probably going to continue to cramp for the next hour, which is probably at least, if not all of the performance that you're going to be doing during the exercise. Right. So what we don't know, right? There may be a link to hydration, but it's not definitive, right? So crampers tend to sweat more and lose more fluids than non-crampers and lose more electrolytes, but there is a large variability. So generally, right, a lot of things that we know about cramping are very, very poor, right? Are very, very weak. So we think that it has to do with hydration, but because there's so much variability, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to do with hydration levels or with crampers losing more fluid, right? So there's very, very weak evidence for mustard or pickle juice, right? Not much change in sodium blood plasma, right? Pickle juice may help shorten cramps, but it could just be due to psychological changes. It sits in the stomach but it sits in the stomach for longer, right? So like I said, sorry, my jumbled words there. the psychological changes from ingesting pickle juice, because you think that it will help, is probably more beneficial for the cramp than the actual sodium or potassium from the pickle juice itself, right? Chloride could be more important, right? So sodium chloride, right? Chloride, the chloride ion could be more important than we previously thought. And what this more than likely is saying, what's more likely is really leading us to, is that it's a combination of these factors. Much like, let's say, a hangover, which I'm sure we've all experienced, right? The factors that accumulate to give you that hangover are multiple, or are very, very variable, right? I myself, right, when I used to drink a lot in my undergrad days, would get brutal hangovers, be hungover until 6, 7, 8 o'clock, right? And even sometimes when I like to have myself a good night, right, I'll be hungover a lot the next day. And the factors that accumulate to cause that hangover are very variable. Same with cramps, right? So it could be dehydration, it could be electrolyte loss, it could be localized factors, right? It could be substrate depletion, it could be a whole bunch of different things that are causing these cramps. So any one thing, any one fix is probably not what you need. You need to be effectively training and preparing for all of these diminishments that could be causing these cramps, right? So it may be related to local fatigue, right? Dehydration causes early fatigue. Eating something like banana spikes blood glucose, not potassium, which may be the reason they help with cramps, right? So bananas might be good for cramps, but it might be slightly good for cramps because they're spiking blood glucose. It has nothing to do with the potassium within those bananas, right? Which I'm sure is news to a lot of people. There are also physiological mechanisms, but some researchers also think that it could be due to psychological excitement, right? Higher stress or pain results in higher electrical activity, which could predispose to cramping. So if you are not able to process the stress of the event that you are going through, right, that may cause some sort of disruption in the electrical processing within the muscle or electrical signal to the muscle, which may cause more cramping, right? There's limited evidence for products like heat guards, hot shot, right? Those things that are meant to mitigate the heat buildup within the body. There's very limited evidence for those things, and they don't seem to have the most effective outcome on cramping, right? So the best management strategy is just to keep a record of cramps and factors associated with it. So find out what's causing your cramps, right? Keep a record of what you're doing. Track your sleep, track your fatigue, your stress, your injury, track your diet, your intake, right? And try to monitor and see what things are changing around the times that you are cramping, and see if you can augment or change those things in your diet or your sleep in order to help further prevent the cramping. Right. So there's a few different articles looking at exercise-associated muscle cramps. Essentially, what these are showing, right, what these are saying, is that these cramps are very, very common, obviously, in exercise, right? Athletes experience a lot of cramps, but a lot of the common remedies for these cramps are not very effective, right? Even at our local football team at UND, I remember talking to a few of the football players. I was friends with quite a few of them, and they would say, they'd be cramping during the game, and they'd be like, "Oh, I got my pickle juice afterwards, and it didn't seem to help that much," or it did help me, or whatever it might be. And just talking to them, like, what else do your coaches tell you to do with cramping? And they're like, they just tell us to drink more water, right? So that just shows you how poor the athletic training team was at the University of North Dakota, is they didn't fully understand cramping, which is a massive issue for their athletes, right? And so or to understand this issue more completely, you need to look at it in a more overarching sense. You look at a lot more factors than just potential dehydration or electrolyte depletion, right? And so we're looking at here, right? We're looking at all sorts of different things that can cause or lead to exercise-induced muscle cramps, right? So there's all sorts of different things. I'm not going to go through each of these things. You can take a peek at this if you wish, but essentially you see how complex exercise-induced muscle cramps are, and what there's a high amount of individual characteristics that can be modulated or changed that can cause muscle cramps in all sorts of individuals. Right, so metabolic acidosis, right? We've talked about this before. So this accumulation of byproducts, right? So lactic acid is being produced, but quickly dissociate. So lactate and hydrogen ions, right? So remember, the problem here though is our lactate. No, the problem here is our hydrogen ions, right? The hydrogen ions are what are causing the acidosis, and that is what is mitigated, or that is what is mitigating your performance, right? Lactate can be used for energy, right? The hydrogen ions are what need to be removed. So the accumulation of hydrogen ions is this acidosis. This is the decrease in pH that we've talked about many a times. And the reason that I'm kind of beating this dead horse here is because it does not matter does not matter how many times I talk about this, right? In all of my classes that I've taught, I will talk about acidosis, right? And I will put a question on the final exam, hint, hint, question for your final exam that is asking what is the problem here. And at least a quarter of the class will still answer lactate. They will still answer that lactate is the predominant mechanism of fatigue here, when in reality, I already said it probably 20 times in this class, and I will continue to say it probably 20 more times in this class. And I said it probably 20 times in my other classes, that the hydrogen ion accumulation is the acidosis, and that is what is the primary mechanism of fatigue. That is what's causing your diminishment in exercise, is not the lactate. The lactate functions as a buffer by binding those hydrogen ions and depleting those hydrogen ions, as well as lactate can be later utilized as fuel. Right, so we see here these hydrogen ions, right? These hydrogen ions are getting in here and they're disrupting this myosin actin cross-bridge cycling. We should recognize this. Here's our myosin head, our thick filaments, our actin, our thin filaments, our troponin, right? Our troponin, which bonds calcium, and our tropomyosin, which is covering the sites, right? Hydrogen ions can get in there when they accumulate, right? And they interfere with the function of calcium ions, right? Which causes a decrease in contractile force, right? So now because you have these hydrogen ions floating around inside the sarcomere, inside the actual contractile unit of the muscle, right? This is diminishing your ability to produce cross bridges, to produce power strokes, which is going to diminish your ability to produce force, right? This is the peripheral mechanism of fatigue that is mitigating your ability to perform as high capacity because you are not able to produce as much force. Right, so we see muscle pH, right? We see muscle pH drops very, very rapidly, right? Remember that pH drop means acidosis accumulation, right? Because the lower the number of the pH, the more acidic it is, right? So pH drops very, very rapidly during exercise, right? And then recovers slowly over time, right? So what we need is we need buffers in the body, right? We need things that can help. We need things that can help mitigate acidosis accumulation, right? And one of those things is a bicarbonate buffer, right? We'll talk about that in a second here, I believe. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second here. Bicarbonate buffer. It is meant to reduce acidosis in the bloodstream. And if you don't have that buffer, right, you don't have that buffer, right, you would drop in pH so rapidly that first of all, you'd have to diminish exercise very, very quickly, but also you would probably get into a state of shock, right? Because the acidosis in your body is so rampant, you're not able to buffer it with these normal buffers in your body. And what a buffer is, right? This is just showing recovery over time, acidosis accumulation, recovery over time, right? Inorganic phosphates. So we can see a lot of things from here. See phosphocreatine depletion, and that's recovery over time. We see inorganic phosphate, and that makes sense. Inorganic phosphates are when ATP is cleaved, right? So we see inorganic phosphates over time, then they are depleted. We see our phosphoric acid, right? Phosphoric acid increases over time, and then it's depleted. We see our pH decrease over time, right? See your hydrogen ions increase over time, and we see this blip and then decrease over time as well, which is a very complex issue that we're not going to get into. But essentially, remember that hydrogen ions increasing over time, then they'll be depleted eventually after exercise, right? So we have our buffers, and what a buffer is if you think about a buffer just in general, a buffer is something that kind of prevents something. It kind of gets in between something, right? And so in this case, the chemical buffers help to mitigate the pH drop, right? They help to bind those free hydrogen ions so that they're not just running around rampant and decreasing your body's ability to go through exercise, right? And so in the bloodstream, intracellularly, intracellularly, right? Chemical buffers like bicarbonates, right? Help to mitigate exercise, right? Hold on a second here. Yeah, there's a typo here. I thought so. Right. So bicarbonate is an extracellular buffer here. So I apologize for this confusion here. Bicarbonate is actually an extracellular buffer. Bicarbonate is what is in the bloodstream that bonds hydrogen ions and helps get rid of those hydrogen ions. So if you remember talking about ventilatory threshold, right, and breathing more quickly to reduce acidosis in the body, that's what's happening here. Bicarbonate is binding those hydrogen ions. And by you ventilating out more CO2 more quickly, it allows those bicarbonate ions to bind more hydrogen ions, bring that to the lungs, and then release it as CO2 essentially, right? And so bicarbonate is functioning as buffer by binds those hydrogen ions. Your increased ventilation, specifically at ventilatory threshold, helps you to release those hydrogen ions in the form of releasing out CO2, right? That's the way that your body mitigates acidosis. And that's a little bit more complex reaction than we're talking about in this class. But essentially, increased ventilation increases the buffer's ability to bind hydrogen ions and therefore mitigate the accumulation of acidosis, right? Right. So active recovery facilitates pH recovery, right? So if you go through active recovery, right, we see passive recovery here. It takes longer to get back to resting conditions, okay? So we see here within the first, 20, 40 hour specifically of exercise, right, or post-exercise, active recovery is much, much more effective at reducing the accumulation of acidosis or replenishing and bringing back pH to its normal levels, right? So after about 2 hours here, we see that there really isn't much difference between active and passive recovery. So I know a lot of like times in baseball, we would be told that we needed to run after exercise because it would make us ready to go the next day. It really doesn't make that much of a difference, right? But you see, let's say Michael Phelps in the Olympics, right, when he's swimming, right, if he has events that are like an hour apart, what he will do is in between events, so let's say he does his butterfly, 100-meter butterfly, and then he has the 100-meter freestyle an hour and a half later, right, what he will do is he'll jump into another pool and go through active recovery because it brings back your pH levels to a normal level. It helps you reduce that acidosis and bring it back to a normal level much more quickly than passive recovery. But again, after about 2 hours, the difference between these two recovery mechanisms is pretty null. So we can talk about beta-alanine supplementation. So if any of you know what beta-alanine is, right, you should know beta-alanine is a very common ingredient in energy drinks, specifically in pre-workout, right? Beta-alanine, right, is a precursor to carnosine, right? Carnosine is found in muscle cells and is an intramuscular buffer. So we have bicarbonate in the bloodstream as an extracellular buffer, and then carnosine is an intracellular buffer. And beta-alanine is used as one of the products, is used as one of the reactants to make carnosine. So if you were supplementing beta and alanine, right, you should have readily available histidine in your body, and that means you can produce more carnosine. More carnosine means more intracellular buffer. More intracellular buffer means a better ability of your body to handle the acidosis that is coming about because of your exercise, right? And we're saying here that beta alanine is a rate-limiting precursor to carnosine, right? You have readily available histidine, so in order to make sure that you are making the amount of carnosine that you need, sometimes it is beneficial to supplement with beta-alanine. Right, so we're looking at the effects of histidine and beta-alanine supplementation on human muscle carnosine storage. So we're seeing here essentially that beta-alanine, right, is effectively increasing, the amount of work you can complete, as well as it's increasing the amount of carnosine stored in the muscles. Because you're increasing the amount of carnosine in the muscles, you're increasing their ability to buffer acidosis, which means that you can perform at a higher pace for a longer period of time, right? As well as we do the same thing with bicarbonate supplementation, right? So sodium bicarbonate elevates plasma bicarbonate concentration, right, which is our extracellular buffer. If we have higher amounts of extracellular buffer in the body, we can more effectively buffer the acidosis that is being produced by exercise, right? And essentially, we can effectively exercise at higher capacities for longer. And if we look at this complex reaction right here, or semi-complex reaction right here, right, this is the equilibrium reaction for bicarbonate, right? So this is effectively what is allowing us to mitigate acidosis in the body, right? I said that you can mitigate acidosis by ventilating more quickly, right? You ventilate out more CO2 more quickly, right? That helps you to deplete and to mitigate the amount of acidosis in the body. And it functions because of this equilibrium reaction right here. And you can think of an equilibrium reaction as if essentially just 3 barrels of water, okay? So we have a barrel of water here, right? We have a barrel of water here, and we have a barrel of water here, okay? So if we connected these 3 barrels of water via a hose, right? If we put a hose from this barrel to this barrel, right? And we put a hose from this barrel to this barrel, okay? If we were to take all of the water out of this barrel, we were to drain this barrel right here, take all of the water out of it, what would happen to the water in these 2 other barrels if they're all connected? Right? So if you were thinking about it, right, what should happen here is the water from each of these barrels should flow this way, right? It should flow towards the empty barrel. That makes sense. Water flows downhill or it flows to its area of least concentration, right? So since there was no water in this barrel and there's still the water in these 2 barrels, right, it's going to flow this way, right? And the same thing, but opposite. Let's say, right? Let's say that we added a bunch of water to this barrel. Okay. Let's say we've added a bunch of water to this barrel. Okay. What's going to happen? Well, again, the water is going to flow in this direction, right? It's going to flow this way in these barrels, right? The same thing is occurring with this equilibrium reaction within the body. If we are removing CO2, we are shifting this reaction this way, which means that more bicarbonates are going to bond more hydrogen ions to make carbonic acid, and more carbonic acids are going to become water and CO2. I don't know what's going on here. Sorry. Water and CO2 to be breathed out, right? So if we decrease the amount of CO2 by ventilating more, we cause this reaction to shift to the left here. We cause hydrogen ions to bond to bicarbonate, become carbonic acid, and those carbonic acids to dissociate into water and carbon dioxide for us to breathe out, right? As well as, like I said, if we are adding hydrogen ions, right, that is also causing the reaction to shift to the left, okay? So now, not only are we removing CO2, which causes the reaction to shift to the left, we are also adding hydrogen ions because we are exercising, causing the reaction to shift even more to the left, right? And this is the way that this equilibrium reaction functions in a way to buffer acidosis. This is how the bicarbonate ions bond the hydrogen ions and then become the CO2 that you are breathing out, right? That is why ventilatory threshold occurs at high intensity exercise in order to remove this acidosis. And this is the function by which it occurs, right? As well as these things, these metabolites can disrupt neural signals, right? So they can affect central drive. The brain activates muscle fibers to protect the body or prevent fatigue. So like I said at the very beginning of this lecture, fatigue can function as a protective mechanism, right? So essentially it is telling the brain, it is telling the central nervous system, hey, we need to slow down because the exercise pace that we are working at right now, if we were to continue it, would be detrimental to the body. So what we do, right, we need to tell the brain, hey, we need to slow down. So they function in a way that are almost protective to keep you from exercising too hard, right? So external stimuli can help overcome this, right? So chemical, intrinsic, extrinsic factors, right? Elite athletes and populations tend to endure more pain. So they have probably higher levels of extrinsic factors, right? They have higher levels of motivation, and have a better training environment, right? As well as they have better intrinsic factors, right? So they have a better ability to process that pain, to deal with that pain, to process the acidosis and those metabolites, right? So they have a variety of different factors, right? Chemical factors. They have a higher source of bicarbonate and carnosine potentially to help them mitigate that fatigue and continue to perform at a higher level for longer. All right, so that pretty much summarizes, or that brings up the end of our lecture here. So in summary, right, I threw a lot of stuff at you here, and this is a lot of information about fatigue. And a lot of people think about fatigue in an incorrect way or a slightly incorrect way. They don't fully understand what's occurring. And we need to remember here that fatigue is a very, very complex mechanism, right? None of these things occur by solo, right? None of these things occur on their own, right? They all occur in tandem and in conjunction with each other, right? And all these things together are what causing you to feel tired and fatigued during exercise, right? So peripheral fatigue is due to changes in the muscle, right? Specifically, central fatigue is due to decreases in signals from the brain or decrease in the effectiveness of those signals, right? Depletion hypothesis is related to running out of neural or energy substrates, right? So if you're running out of substrates like glucose to burn or PCR, or if you're running out of acetylcholine in the neuron, right, that is part of the depletion hypothesis, right? Accumulation hypothesis is related to increasing levels of metabolic byproducts. So we talk about hydrogen ions a lot, right? I would know about hydrogen ions and what they do because, right, that is the main function of accumulation hypothesis, as well as we talked about inorganic phosphates and ADPs. These can also provide a detriment to exercise, right? So creatine supplementation can increase our PCR levels, which increases ATP PCR energy system duration, right? So like we talked about before, creatine supplementation is good for short-term exercise, right? As glycogen levels decrease, RPE increases. RPE is your rating of perceived exertion. So as you deplenish the amount of glycogen in your body and specifically in the muscles that are active, right, you're going to increase your feelings of fatigue. Hypoglycemia is low glucose levels in the blood, right? So hypoglycemia is when you are going through low amounts of glucose in your blood, which can lead to diminishments in performance. and in extreme cases can lead to nausea. It can lead to all sorts of different detrimental outcomes, right? Dehydration and low electrolyte levels can cause fatigue, right? So low amounts of fluids in the body, right, lead to deplenishments and cardiac output, specifically through stroke volume, right, which can lead to a decrease in the amount of nutrients delivered to the muscle and the removal of those negative metabolic byproducts, right, as well as low electrolyte levels can cause fatigue, right? Hyperthermia can cause fatigue, right? We talked about being too hot, right? It causes fatigue both by central mechanisms and peripheral mechanisms, right? And the accumulation of byproducts of muscle contractions can lead to metabolic acidosis, decreasing cross bridging. So that's specifically talking about those hydrogen ions, right? Those hydrogen ions not only induce central fatigue by dropping the pH of the body, but they also directly affect your ability to produce cross bridge cycles, which means it's directly affecting your ability to produce force, right? And then finally, beta alanine can help buffer against metabolic acidosis as well as bicarbonate, but bicarbonate supplementation may affect your GI health, so it's not overly as common as beta alanine supplementation. And so today I know the lecture was relatively long, and it threw a lot of information at you, and these things are kind of all being tied in together, and they're kind of being given to you in different ways, right? So it might be confusing. I'm trying to get this to you in a way that essentially summarizes how all these things work in tandem together, but I understand that it may be confusing. So once again, if you have any questions, please reach out to me and I will do the best that I can. If not, I will see you guys in the next lecture. Have a good one.